Hello, my name's John Rack and I'm Dyslexia Action's Head of Assessment Services and the Director of Education and Policy. I've been a psychologist and done many assessments in my time, and I'm today going to talk to you about how we assess for dyslexia, what kinds of assessments there are, how they work, and how you might decide what kind of assessment you need. So the first thing to say, and I usually begin this when I start an assessment, is to say that an assessment should be a positive experience. I usually say we're trying to find out the things that someone is good at, to understand what they can do easily and what they find fun. Then we want to try to understand the things that maybe they have a problem with. And that could be something like reading, spelling, maths, it could be remembering things, all kinds of things, and everybody is good at some things and less good at others. And most of the time that doesn't matter, we don't all expect to be the same. But there are some kinds of difficulties that really do get in the way of progress in school, that cause blocks or barriers to learning. We call some of these things specific learning difficulties. They make it hard to progress. Even when you're getting good help or you're trying really hard, there's something there that just makes that harder for you than it is for other people around you. And that can obviously be quite frustrating and challenging, especially if it's not recognised and understood. So one of the main purposes of an assessment is to try to understand if there are these kinds of blocks or barriers. What are they, in what kind of areas? To know that they're there to start with is helpful. And once you know that, then you're well on the way to finding ways around them or improving those skills either by training and practice or by using compensatory tools like technology, computers for example. So if we know where the problems are, we know what's making it hard to progress, we have a much better chance of working out how to move forward or how to get around the problem. So you've noticed that I've been talking about assessment here rather than about labelling and saying someone is or is not dyslexic. Sometimes a label really does matter, but it shouldn't stand in the way of taking action. We don't need to put an exact label on something. Many people don't quite fit neatly into a category anyway. They have some signs of dyslexia and some signs of other things, or they might be on the edge where we say, well, I don't think we really need to call this dyslexia, but you have some of those features, some of those characteristics, and there are certainly some good things that you could do because we now understand why, where your difficulties lie, even if they're not exactly the standard or typical ones. So labelling doesn't always matter, but finding out what the source of the problem is really important. So there are different ways that you can do this, different kinds of assessments. The first kind involves simply screening. We look at the kinds of problems that often come up for people who are dyslexic, and you can actually look for those in very young children, even as young as 4 or 5. Young children are quite changeable and they don't always do their best on the day, so those sorts of assessments can be a bit unreliable. And if you want a conclusive answer to say whether this is something to do with dyslexia or not, it's usually best to wait until around 6 or 7 or even older. However, an early screening to show the risk factors or the areas where difficulties might occur can be useful, because then you know to put some early action in to concentrate on developing those skills and to finding ways of, around them, even at an early stage. And what we know is that the first stages of learning to read depend very heavily on language ability. That is to say, the ability to break down the spoken sounds of words into their individual elements, and to learn how these can map onto letters, not always exactly, but actually quite usefully and very helpfully in terms of being able to crack the alphabetic code. So children who struggle with this key concept of phonological awareness are at risk for long-term reading difficulties, and that's where we would focus our early screening checklists and tests on. Later on, we might be more interested in the wider impact of dyslexia, and those language skills to do with holding word sounds in your mind often also cause problems in remembering, in what we call short-term or working memory. And so that's a second area of focus for a screening or checklist. How good are people at retaining information that they've heard and using that for different kinds of problem-solving tasks? And later on, what becomes important is speed or fluency. And so tests or assessments will focus on those skills, perhaps when children are coming up to 10 or 11 and they're more reliable in terms of their performance on speeded tasks. So essentially these are the kinds of what we call information processing skills that an assessment would focus on. And it could be a screening assessment, it could be a skills profile, or it could be a full diagnostic assessment where the objective is to say conclusively whether someone does or does not have a pattern which is typical of dyslexia, whether it would be appropriate to say that they're dyslexic. And of course, saying someone is dyslexic is only part of the story. We need to say to what extent and what other things go along with it, because actually dyslexia on its own is not, it should not be anyway, a problem that really gets in the way of long-term progress. It's when dyslexia occurs alongside other difficulties, and particularly when it's not recognised and people lose their confidence and motivation, that's when we get real difficulties. So those co-occurring or complicating factors that sometimes arise when dyslexia has not been picked up early, they are the focus of the fuller diagnostic assessment that's done usually by a psychologist or a trained teacher who has extra abilities and qualifications in using diagnostic tests. So how are you going to decide what kind of assessment you need, particularly if you're coming to Dyslexia Action or to some other outside provider? Well, usually what we recommend is a staged approach. So in the very early ages, we would focus on a checklist or screening to look at risk factors, and then later on, when the focus is on learning, to look at a skills profile. A skills profile is also often very useful in the workplace, where the focus is on particular demands of a job and understanding where strengths and weaknesses may be impacting on that, so that an individual development plan can be put together to show ways of getting around those challenges, and particularly focusing on compensation and alternative strategies. And that can be done in the workplace, or it can be done in school without the need for a formal recognition or formal identification of dyslexia or other specific learning difficulties. So a skills profile is very much the middle level. It will identify quite clearly targets, things to work on, but it won't be as comprehensive as the full diagnostic assessment, which will look not only in greater depth at those specific learning difficulties, but it will focus on the areas where co-occurring difficulties are often seen, and it will explore the degree of difficulty compared to others. So it will enable you to come up with a more clear picture of whether this degree of difficulty is something that needs a small amount of short-term help, or whether perhaps it's something that's going to require a sustained support over the longer period, which might be something guiding choice of school or career choice. Something quite substantial or significant like that is best done only after a full assessment. So I hope that's of some help in understanding what an assessment does. It's not a black or white test. The full assessment is quite involved. It's focusing on strengths and weaknesses, and sometimes quite subtle difficulties have to be explored with especially chosen tests in order to really dig down and understand, or try to understand, why for this person there are some things that are a challenge, whether that's in school or at work or in whatever it is that they're doing. And that assessment takes about 2 hours perhaps, and a full report is given which will identify areas to work on and also a full description of strengths and weaknesses. For many people that's illuminating and empowering, because once they understand the ways in which they're different and they realise that the struggles that they've had make sense in terms of a recognised profile, they don't feel quite so strange or even stupid. Sadly, many people with dyslexia do grow up feeling that because they don't learn when others around them do learn, that they are less able or stupid. And dyslexia has nothing to do with intelligence. It's quite independent. Very often people with dyslexia are quite capable. Sometimes those abilities enable them to mask their dyslexia. And that's one reason why sometimes an assessment does have to look at that profile to see where reading and spelling difficulties are compared to other skills and abilities. But this is getting on to more complicated subjects, perhaps something we can come back to on another occasion. The main conclusion I want you to take from this is that we have a range of assessments that will enable you to take action early. You don't have to wait, but action is much better focused and targeted as a result of an assessment that understands the reasons behind the progress and the problems that are there. And a range of assessments will provide that sort of information. Which one you need will depend on circumstances, and it's always an option to call or come and talk to one of the members of staff at Dyslexia Action to help determine what is going to be best in the circumstances that you or your child is in at this moment.